I'm curious, just to start, before we hit record, you said you went from hurting people to helping people,
Yeah.
and I find that very interesting. You have this athletic background, and
Mhm.
now you're doing all this incredible work that is giving people resources and healing people and teaching people how to heal people.
Mhm.
When did you make that shift?
Well, I started boxing when I was 12, and what made me start boxing is, as I was sharing with you, my father was an extremely violent man, and, um, his abuse made my brother very violent,
Mm,
and so by the time my brother was in the 7th grade, he was addicted to drugs, and, we didn't really have anybody to support us with how to deal with that level of stress. And I was so worried my dad was gonna kill somebody that I knew it at a deep level that I had to learn to defend myself. So I asked my mother if I could please join a boxing club. Um, and the closest boxing club was like a 35-mile drive. But through luck, really, through a friend, one of my best friend's dads built NASCAR engines and later became a big help to me when I was a stock car racer, actually. But somehow, it's been so long, I can't remember how, but I met this guy named Mickey Hale, who was in the United States Air Force stationed in Comox, which is, I came from a place called Courtney, which is, there's three towns almost touching each other, Comox, Courtney, and Cumberland.
mm,
And there's an Air Force base in Comox, and it's half Canadian, half American. And he was stationed there, and he used to be a boxing trainer for the United States Air Force. And so somehow I got introduced to him, and he was excited to know that there was somebody that wanted to learn to box because they didn't have a boxing program there. And so I think my mom paid him like $20 a visit. And he actually drove out to our farm for quite some time and gave me private boxing lessons. And then it got to the point where he said, to grow further, you're going to need to join a club because you need variety and you need other athletes. I'm a 12-year-old and he's a full grown man, right?
mm.
So then my mom said she would get me in the club. And so we started going. I think I went twice a week for about 3 years. And I also joined Taekwondo. So I spent several years in Taekwondo while also going to the boxing club. And I got frustrated with Taekwondo because our instructor was a fourth degree black belt, but he wouldn't let anybody really make full contact. It was more like point fighting. But when I got there, the black belts were trying to beat the hell out of me.
Mm,
And by that time, I already had 3 years in the boxing ring.
right.
And they didn't like the fact that even the black belts, I would just get in on them and I would just beat the hell out of them. And so the instructor was so upset that this little white belt 17-year-old kid, 16, 17, was beating the shit out of his black belts that he kept chewing me out. And I kept saying, well, what are you doing chewing me out? These guys are black belts and they're trying to kill me. Watch, you know? And so I got so frustrated. Me and a buddy of mine who was also what we would call a purist got upset because they kept giving belts out just for attendance, but not for really developing skill.
Mm,
So it's just like if you were there for a year, you'd get a belt. And I'm like, that's bullshit. And so I finally just said, I'm not going to do this anymore because I want to learn to fight,
mm.
boxing is full on, you really have to keep your shit together because
Yeah.
people will knock you out. And so what we did is a bunch of us got together and I had some money at that time. I was working in logging camps and making good money. And I rented a warehouse and we built our own boxing gym in there and built our own ring and put heavy bags in it. And about a dozen of us that were all what I would call purists got together every weekend and we had our own tournaments and we just fought each other. And the rule was you have to tap out or you get knocked out.
Wow.
So we had our own MMA system going. And the guys I grew up with were all hardcore athletes. Two of my buddies were nationally ranked motocross racers. 6 of them had black belts in different martial arts. One of them became Mr. Canada in professional bodybuilding. One of my buddies that I grew up with and trained with became the world champion in full contact kickboxing in 1986.
Wow.
And he was my sparring partner for 3 years. His name's Lloyd Anderson. He was the Canadian lightweight champion in boxing as well. We all came from this little valley. There were several of them were top-ranked elite skiers. And it's all just a bunch of farmers and loggers, and they're all just ass kickers. So by the time I got to the Army and fought my way onto the Army boxing team, I had enough skill to get on. The only way you can get on the Army boxing team is you got to beat somebody on the team. And it's, I think I told you we were the 3rd ranked amateur team in the world.
Wow.
There was guys on the team with many guys with over 300 fights.
Wow.
And one of our guys, I think his record was 320-4. Many of them were national champions. My buddy Ron Wallstrom was Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine champion several times. He was Iowa State Golden Gloves champion 6 times. So these are badasses.
And those are professional fights?
No, these are amateur.
Amateur fights.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happened was I was fighting for the championship of the 82nd Airborne Division, and almost on the boxing team of the 30 fighters, 28 of them were paratroopers. So the paratroopers are, that's an elite level soldier, and I was a paratrooper. So it takes the right mentality to fight like that. And the point I'm getting at here is that I got into the championship of the 82nd Airborne Division, and it's an interesting story. It's illegal for officers to fight enlisted men in the Army because historically what happened, whenever an enlisted man would beat an officer, all the enlisted men would start being disrespectful to officers.
Wow.
It would affect them psychologically. So they would say, they would take on the persona that, we're tougher than you. And so they made it illegal for officers to fight enlisted men in any boxing tournament. But somehow an officer got permission from the general of the 82nd Airborne Division to enter the tournament, which was quite a shock for a lot of people because this, technically it's against military law. Well, it turns out the guy that they put in, they were probably betting tons of money on, and he was a very, very skilled Puerto Rican boxer.
Wow.
And I was watching this guy. It was a 3-day tournament. There was probably, I don't know, over 100 fighters in the tournament. And it's a pyramid system. So I was coming up one side of the pyramid, he was coming up the other, and I was watching this guy knock guys out sometimes in as little as 20 or 30 seconds. I mean, knocking them out ice cold. And so I'm like, holy shit, this guy's good. And he's taller and leaner than me. He's kind of like a Thomas Hearns build, if you remember. You're probably too young. Thomas Hearns was a badass fighter. Yeah, if you just look up Thomas Hearns on the internet, he's like right up there with Sugar Ray Leonard.
Wow. Type
fighter. He was probably 6 feet tall and long and skinny and hard to get in on. And, if I remember right, he had like 70 or 80 fights under his belt. But he was hitting me with shot. I mean, he hit me so hard in one round that my entire left arm went numb. And I had nerve jolts like lightning running up and down my spine. And I used to fight with some of the best fighters in the world, and I'd never been hit that hard in my life. And I immediately knew I had to get rid of this guy before he knocked me out. And this was the championship fight for the 82nd Airborne. There was 5,000 soldiers in there.
Wow.
Going wild and beating the bleachers, and it was crazy. And my company commander told me, "Don't lose this fight. I bet a lot of money on you." And so there's just tons of pressure on me. And he hit me a second time so hard that the referee 8-counted me. And you're not allowed to coach boxers in the ring if you're outside the ring. And my buddy Ron Wallstrom, who's one of the best fighters I ever knew, I was stoned out of my mind, and I just happened to look over and I noticed my wife was crying her eyes out. And I'm like, why is Sue crying? And Ronnie went like this with his hands, which is our code language, because we use sign language so nobody knows what we're saying. He said, "Paul, wake up, you're about to go out. This means you have to start You have to win now or you're dead.
Wow.
So as soon as I saw that, I went, oh my God. And I looked at my hands and went, wow, I'm in a boxing match. And I realized right there I was in trouble. Fortunately, the bell rang, the end of the second round. And my cornerman was Nathaniel Finch, who was the heavyweight champion in the United States at that time in amateur boxing. And he said, Paul, when the bell rings, run across the ring and hit him as hard as you can. He won't expect it. And it's interesting because we had been practicing this technique as a surprise in our boxing training for about 2 weeks.
Wow.
So I was already familiar with the strategy. So as soon as the bell rang, I just jumped off my stool and sprinted across the ring and hit this guy with the hardest right hand I could throw. And I got him right in the eye. And I hit him so hard his feet literally came up in the ground. He was like horizontal to the ground in about 3 feet, and he bounced off the deck, and he was out so cold it took multiple doctors about 5 or 6 minutes with smelling salts. And literally I thought I'd killed the guy. It scared the living hell out of me. But it turned out I detached his retina, so he had to retire from boxing. I won the fight, but it moved me so deeply emotionally that I remember sitting in the change room for about 3 hours just crying because I realized I felt like I had crossed the line of sportsmanship. I felt I hadn't done anything illegal by any means, but inside of myself, and because I was raised in such a violent environment, I remember my brother attacking me with pitchforks and fire pokers and weapons, and I would have been very badly injured, and I couldn't let my guard down because he would kill me. He was very violent. I've actually still got 2 holes in my skull from where one he drove a fire poker through my skull. Another time he took my father's .44 Magnum pistol and turned it over and drove the hammer through my skull.
Wow.
And so I've been in these fights where I'm almost going unconscious, and so it activates something very primal in you when you realize your life's on the edge.
Yep.
And this guy hit me 2 times so hard. Not only was my ego on the line, but I felt like I didn't know what would happen. I'd never been hit that hard in my life by somebody. And I've been hit by tough guys. I mean, I fought a lot of the best guys in the world. But this guy was something else.
Jeez.
And I knew I was in trouble because I was watching this guy come up for 3 days just taking people out like they were cheese, you know?
Mowing people over.
I'm like, nothing. And I'm like, oh boy, here we go.
Wow.
And so inside of myself, I had the realization that I had been fighting all these years because my anger and my fear toward my father was so strong that I had been doing this to protect myself and knew that one day I might have to protect my brother, my sister, my other sister, or my mother because he was so violent. And I realized at that moment, my dad is who hit that guy. And I felt sad. And inside of me, my mother became a yogi when I was 12. So by this time, I'd had many years of meditation. I spent my 15th summer with the monks, going deep into meditation training and various other trainings. So I had a very deep spiritual side to me while I was also a competitive athlete. And so at the moment that happened, I realized I didn't want to hurt people anymore. And I realized I was only hurting people even as a fighter because I was afraid to get hurt. And so something inside of me, which I now know is my soul, said, Paul, it's time for you to stop hurting people and start helping them. So this inner voice told me it was time to retire from fighting. And, by that time I'd been 12 years of fighting. And I just made a commitment to myself that I wasn't going to fight anymore. And even now, many people have wanted me to put boxing gloves on over the year or, do some sparring. But as soon as I put gloves on, it's something inside me feels like I'm going to die. It feels like it makes me sad. It's like, you don't need to do that. You know how to protect yourself. You don't need to keep doing that. And so I just made a commitment to myself to take all the energy that I used to put into training for fighting and put it into study and to helping people. And that was what changed my life.